Welcome back to the Biblical Justice Resources podcast. I have a friend who's talked about an exercise she does with her classes. First, she has the students write down what social or political issue they're interested in working on in their life. Then she has them write down how long they expect to work on that issue. It's an interesting exercise because it is often the first time the students are seeing their expectations quantified on paper. Expectations that are suddenly met with questions like, what happens if we reach the end of my expected time period and the work on this issue isn't done? In some ways, we could think about the ways this exercise could help us with setting and adjusting expectations for our life and work, but there's a related question that we're going to focus on here. Whether we have an expected time frame or not, what does it look like to remain committed to the work of justice, especially when things don't go as expected? Specifically today, we're going to approach this question through the example of white individuals who have remained committed to pursuing racial justice, as seen in the research from our guest, Dr. Christine Jeske. Dr. Jeske is Associate Professor of Anthropology at Wheaton College, is the author of 4 books, and previously worked for a decade in Nicaragua, China, and South Africa. Her most recent book, Racial Justice for the Long Haul: How White Christian Advocates Persevere and Why, comes out today as this podcast is being released. Our conversation today centers on the findings from this book, including the different ways individuals come to pursue racial justice, the characteristics and practices of people who remain committed to racial justice, and how we understand not just what we are called to do, but who we are called to be. Now, if you will, join me for this conversation with Dr. Christine Jeske. My name's Eric, and this is the Biblical Justice Resources podcast. Our conversation will begin right after this. The Biblical Justice Resources podcast is supported by listeners like you at patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources. If you're interested in supporting the podcast and helping to resource individuals and the church for the pursuit of biblical justice, please consider giving today at patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources. Again, visit patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources to help support the podcast. Now on with the show. Dr. Jeske, thank you for joining me here today.
It's good to be here.
I have been looking forward to this. So we connected maybe a month ago or so as we're recording to talk about your book that's coming out. And then I read the book and I saw myself in a lot of what people were saying. And so I've been interested to talk about it. But before we get to the contents of the actual book, since I have an anthropologist on the podcast for the first time, I want to talk about anthropology as a discipline briefly. So we've had some recent conversations about anthropology from a theological perspective, but I'm curious what anthropology looks like from a discipline. What is anthropology? How is anthropology practiced, studied, worked out? What does that look like?
Yeah, I love answering this question because I had no idea what anthropology was until I was about 30. And I got asked to teach a class in anthropology when I was working at a seminary in South Africa. And I was like, well, I've never studied that, but they had a textbook and I used it and I was like, this answers the questions that I have had for so long. So anthropology is, one of the things that's unique about it is that it focuses on qualitative research. So for example, with the research topic that I study, one of the quantitative studies that I found really helpful in looking at this topic of like, how do people address racial injustice? There was a survey that was done of thousands of people in 2020, and it found that only 9% of white Christians are interested in, highly motivated to address racial injustice. That's half as many as were the previous year. So it dropped by half from 18 to 9% in that year. It is half as many as white people more broadly across the country. And it's only 1/5 as many as Black Christians. So you can look at a statistic like that. You can say, okay, we know that there are less white Christians engaged in racial justice work than much of the population. But you don't know why. So, anthropology or cultural anthropology, which is what I do specifically, is often looking at these why questions or how questions. Um, there are four branches to anthropology. One of them is archaeology. So sometimes when people hear I'm an anthropologist, they're like, oh, like Indiana Jones. And I'm like, no. First of all, he would not be ethically approved by any anthropologist today. Like the stuff he was doing would not work. But also, he was more of an archaeologist. And then there's a branch that's linguistics. There's a branch that is biological anthropology. And then what I do is cultural anthropology. And usually how we do that is a lot of interviewing. And it's not just interviewing, it's also like hanging out with people. We call it participant observation. So my research looked like interviewing 70 people and also spending a lot of time at churches and racial justice, like trainings and things related to that with people. So that's how we do research. And it kind of fits in with these other disciplines. If you think about like theologians are looking at what is sort of the ultimate like purpose or like how do you interpret the Bible on a topic. Historians are looking at it from the past. Quantitative researchers are looking at it from like big surveys or data at like a large scale. And then we do this kind of thing that's in between. It's like smaller scale, but really in depth with the people that we spend time with.
Yeah. And that I think fits in well. Well, first the how and the why. That's what I like to talk about here on the podcast. So I'm
Awesome.
glad we have that in common here. But also, having talked about the anthropology from a theological perspective is one thing we've done. We also had Michael Emerson on the show
Yeah.
a month ago, as we're recording, maybe,
Hmm.
talking about sociology. And so that's a lot of he had a lot of the quantitative things. And it
Right.
was
Yeah.
really interesting to read The Religion of Whiteness and then read Racial Justice for the Long Haul back to back ish within the same month or so, because it was this like, if Religion of Whiteness, I think, speaks to that 9% of white Christians, like that number being that low and where the
Hmm.
rest of
Or like,
white
yeah,
Christians
the
are.
other 91%, right?
And now, yeah, and now Racial Justice for the Long Haul talks about that 9%, what is keeping them motivated, keeping
Exactly.
them in the work, in the being, all of the things put together. So I'm curious, you talk about it in the book to kind of lead off, but I'm curious how the research came about. What was the impetus behind beginning the research, and then how did you go into actually processing the research?
Yeah. A couple things. So I've been teaching about race and racism for 10 years at Wheaton College, and every semester, it just happened this last week. Every semester, I think, I have a student who at some point will be learning about various kinds of injustice around the world. Like in anthropology, we hit a lot of really hard topics. And I'll have students who will come up to me and say, Dr. Jeske, how do you stay hopeful? And so I've had this kind of sense for a while, like how do you do that? And I teach people like information about what is race, what is racism, what's the history of it. But I had this lingering question of like, does it actually make any difference? Do students actually finish the course, take their final exam and forget it, or do they do something about it? And I have had the privilege through my life of meeting a lot of amazing mentors. And I would say, in short, this is the book that I wish I had when I was a college student or when I was new on this journey. Um, yeah, and it was an opportunity for me to talk to the people I wanted to talk to. Also, like my previous book was a lot about the kind of the more negative side of racism. How does racism play out? How does it interact with unemployment? And I was like, what are people doing about this, and how do they keep doing it?
Yeah, and then I wonder specifically focusing on white individuals who are in this process, in this work. How do we go from just thinking about people who are continuing committed to the work of racial justice? Because you talk about, or you interview not just white people in the book, and
Yeah.
there are some stories of people who are also going through this questioning, trying to maintain hope, things of that nature. Why specifically focus on white individuals in the book?
Hmm. Well, to be totally honest, I started doing this thinking it was going to be like a short little article. It's going to be about white South Africans. And I did some research along those lines in 2019, and I had a plan to go back in 2020. And then COVID happened, and I couldn't go back. And I was like, oh, maybe next year. And then COVID was still happening, so I couldn't. And so I started with like, oh, I'll just do a couple of interviews in the United States, and it grew. And So when it started, I was kind of like, what, how do I include people? And really, I knew that I wanted to study white people because of this thing that white people can leave behind conversations about racism if they choose to, in a way that people of color typically can't, especially when you live in a predominantly white neighborhood or community. And people name this over and over again in my research. So many people said, like, it's different for white people because you can walk away. And so if I wanted to study, like, who are the people who are choosing not to walk away? And also because white people have the privilege in a racial caste system, the question is, like, why would you actively choose to work for something that maybe isn't in your own favor necessarily? So to do that, though, I was really struggling for a while to figure out, how do I do that? There's other people who have researched things like this, and sometimes they'll just choose like one organization that they're going to interview everybody who works for that organization. But you don't know, was everybody at that organization really a model of how to do this well? And I had people literally hear I was doing research on this, and they come up to me and be like, "Oh, I think I should be included in your study." And I'm like, I don't know if I can decide that. How, like, can I make a survey to be like, you checked all the right boxes? Yep, you're really great at racism, or you're great at ending racism. And I realized, like, this is not my decision to make. This is actually something that the people of color in their lives who know them well should be the ones to decide. And so I started by interviewing 30 people of color who are faith leaders or leaders in racial justice organizations, and asked them it through like a pretty long interview, what does racial justice look like for you? What have you seen people do well or poorly? How did you get on this journey yourself? And then had them say, I would ask them, like, who do you know who has been at this for years or even a decade, who's a white person, who maybe you would recommend as a mentor to some white person who's new on this journey? And based on their recommendations, I interviewed another 40 white Christians for the study.
Yeah, that's an interesting, like, it seems applicable to not be self-selecting into the survey, if
Yeah.
that makes sense. As you
Yeah.
just described, having other people saying these are the people rather than like me coming in and saying, I've been working on this for a long time. You don't know who I am. So,
Yeah.
so that
And
makes
it's really
sense.
interesting hearing the interplay between them too. That's something I've never found any other research that has done, is they're talking about their relationship with each other, and hearing the reasons why they would get recommended was often really insightful also. I say in the book at one point, like, often it wasn't so much what they did right, it was about what they did with what they did wrong. Like, how did they recover from what they did wrong? So I had somebody summarize my research as like, it's is writing about these exemplary white people, and nobody in the study I think would want that title for themselves, because part of what I learned through this is like, it's not about getting it perfect. It's really about like being in it, and just having a posture of being willing to be in it, and how you recover when it doesn't go right.
Yeah, that recovery piece is so interesting because it's bringing to mind like, so I grew up being in marching band in drumline, and one of the things that was stressed with my first sort of set of drumline instructors was there are times where what matters is the recovery.
Yeah.
Like you were going to make mistakes, like it's going
Yeah.
to happen. And there was one guy talked about being on stage playing the drums, and he dropped a stick, and he just like smoothly like grabbed the stick out, and he was going to be fine. No one was going to notice. But then like the director was like, "Oh my goodness." So like there are
Yeah.
times where like, so in that instance, like recovery could be like, oh, it's smoothed and no one notices. In other
Mm.
instances, it can be like last night I was at a basketball game and one of the teams just got like blown out of the gym, realistically, like lost by 25 points. It was not good. Like, how are those kids recovering during the game on the team that was losing, and how are they going to recover moving forward? It's not decided yet, like how they're going to respond to what went wrong. And then the next thought that comes to mind, talking about having a group of people who are maybe not exemplary,
Mm.
brings to mind some work that Brene Brown has done and some things I've heard her talk about, like with leaders.
Hmm.
Uh, Specifically, right now, she's talking about a lot about fear, I think, in leaders, and having leaders who she interviews say, if you're going to be talking about people who don't have fear, do not include me in this
Mm.
because they're having to work to overcome their fear as they're going through things. It seems like all of that like ties into it's all very
Yeah.
multifaceted for people.
Yeah.
If people haven't figured this out yet after almost 30 episodes of this podcast, it's multifaceted and there's a whole lot that goes into this.
Hmm.
I am
Yeah.
curious. Oh, if you have any, go ahead if you have any
Well,
thoughts on
I,
that.
I I was just going to say, I was just talking to somebody about what's distinctive about this book compared to other books that this man had read. And he said, I have this whole stack of books on my shelf that are about what you should do to be anti-racist, what you should do to solve the problem. And this book is very much, there's that. It's very much in there. I had one person that I interviewed who even said, as the very last question I often would ask people, what do you want to make sure goes into this book? It was this Black woman who said, make it a book about doing. And so that's important. But what this man I was just talking to pointed out is like, there's not a lot of books about how to be. And I think that
Yeah.
is something that's kind of undernamed is that you can have all the information you want in your mind, and um, you have to also embody it. And that is risky and it's scary and you're going to get it wrong. I describe it as like learning how to dance. So it reminds me of what you just said of like you're going to look funny on the dance floor sometimes. And it's not even just like dancing by yourself, right? You're with other people and you might make them look bad or maybe even dancing sometimes with like knives in your hands that can physically hurt people when you get it wrong. And so recovery is not just like making yourself look good. It's really about like healing. I use the analogy of racism is like a tear in the social fabric. And if you want to repair it, there's a couple things about that analogy that really work well for me, which is like no single individual, like if you think of an individual like the threads in a fabric, no single person gets to mend it themselves. Like you are relating to other people and to make a whole fabric. And that kind of takes the pressure off. Like you kind of, you don't have to do it all yourself. But there's also this thing of like the mending itself can become a beautiful thing. And like when you see like people who do embroidery over patches and things like that, like it can become an art form. And I think that's helpful for us when we think about racial justice too, is it's like we're never going to fully hide the history of hurt that there is, but we can make the healing of it into a display of God's glory in itself.
Yeah. And that's where the recovery will not always be unnoticed. Like that
Yeah.
it will leave marks at times.
Hmm. Yeah.
So yeah, that's great. I was curious, you something with the people who like self-selected to tell you maybe I should be in this versus people who were uh recommended. I mean, you're probably in a pretty big space, so maybe people don't necessarily know each other. But I'm curious if anyone who said maybe I should be in the survey was actually recommended, or like if
Mm.
there is if there, like if the person who would select themselves in is not the type of person who people of color, BIPOC people would say this is the type of person who you should be talking to, who's actually
Yeah.
living into this.
There were a couple people who were along those lines who I think um, I knew of, and they knew of the research and probably knew they would be the kind of person who'd be included, and then they were in fact recommended for it. I I will say I I heard those so many more people who would start it with like I had one man that I talked to. We were just going through like the opening protocol where I'm kind of like, okay, are you okay with this being recorded? It will be anonymized. Is it okay if I quote you exactly, etc. And into the recording, this man was like, I want everyone to know that this is, you can ask me anything. You can ask me about the things that I did wrong. It's really important to me that you know that I'm ready to answer everything and I'm not here to just make myself look good. So, yeah. And that goes into, I don't know if we want to dive into this topic, but one of the most surprising things that I think came out of this research was how pivotal it was for people to have a way to respond to harm and guilt. And I think that often in racial justice work, we focus on getting the right information and maybe having sort of like what I call collision moments where it's like, oh my goodness, that thing was so terrible. I suddenly passionately care about it. And then I'm going to get more information on it. And then I will be told what to do and I will do it. That's sort of the narrative that we often get when we talk about racial justice. And it leaves out this important step, which is what do you do with the harm and the guilt that is involved in a history that can't be fully repaired. And that's where, when people were telling stories of how they figure out how to deal with that, that's where people cried. People, it gets emotional when people start talking about, like, I recognize that I did something totally wrong and I can't ever go back and make it different, but it's there. And I'm like, and how do they deal with that? I can tell you some stories of how they dealt with it.
Yeah, that's one of the many things where I saw myself where either having a collision be like something I had not experienced before is happening, and I'm trying to understand and react to what is happening around me. But then also like interactions I've had with people that I'm maybe never going to see again in my life, where you look back and you're like, that went really poorly,
Mm.
especially when uh, like one in particular that's coming to mind is when like I would have identified myself as someone who cared about this, and
Hmm.
so come out of it being like I'm supposed to be a guy who knows what's going on, and that just went sideways.
Hmm.
Like, and I think you have a couple of these the collisions, and of like there's a group of three different things of like ways that people kind of come into this. Can you kind of talk through maybe
Sure.
going from this into how those different themes that came out with people?
Yeah. And maybe I could share some pieces of my own journey also to kind of fit with that. So I grew up in a predominantly white family, or I should say a white family, except for one cousin who was mixed race, and then her father was black. And growing up, my family didn't talk about race very much at all. It was not something that seemed relevant, even though we had different races within our immediate family. Um, and then when I was in college, my cousin's boyfriend was shot and killed suddenly. He was a black man. And this news I received while I was sitting in my dorm room and talking to my mom on the phone. And it just like wrecked me. And I think about that time as sort of holding this set of puzzle pieces that were supposed to be a puzzle of the social world and reality around me. And it was like just destroyed into pieces and sort of walking around being like, can anybody help me figure out how to put this back together? And I couldn't find anybody who could. And it wasn't that race was named in that incident. It was almost that it wasn't named. And yet I knew the thought that went through my head when I got the news that he had been shot was that this doesn't happen in life, except this happens to Black people. And I was like, why do I have that thought? Is that true? Why is that true if it is true? And so that is what I call a collision moment, where you're just struck by the way I put it is your imagination of reality smashes into reality so hard that you can't ignore it. And there's a lot of different kinds of collisions. I name some of them in the book, but one of them is with injustice. One of them is with like just the hierarchical ranking of human beings that race sets up. One of them is with your own culpability. For me too, like I think one of the culpability sides of that piece was like I didn't go to the funeral. My parents, I don't know if they went to the funeral. I don't know why I didn't go to the funeral. Like I look back on that, I'm like, this was my cousin, and why did we not go? So yeah, there's like something there where I'm like, wow, like there was a division in our family there that I wasn't able to name at the time, but I knew it wasn't right, and I didn't know what to do with it. So that's one piece. The next piece that I talk about in the book is what I went into when I was in college after this, which was like holding these puzzle pieces with me, like, can anybody tell me what to do about this? And I call this asking a lot of why. Like I started taking classes that I thought might help. Took a class on Latin American economics that helped me understand like the history of colonialism. I took a class on African history that helped me understand the history of colonialism. But I was still learning so much. I was so blessed by one small thing that happened to me in college, which was I played in I was in a jazz music ensemble class. I played piano. And there was a professor who was the only Black professor in the music department at my college at the time. He came to that class and was telling us about the history of jazz and incorporated in that is just something about race and racism. And it was one of the first times I heard somebody like directly teach about that topic. And at the end of the class, he said, if anybody has questions or wants to understand this more, come talk to me. And he left. And I was like, I need to. Like, there was just a sense of like, "Ooh, that's exactly what I want." But that felt so scary. In part because I was just in such a white world. Like, I didn't have people to talk to about this. So I literally remember walking past his door after my piano lessons of his office. It was like down the hall from my piano lessons over and over again, week after week, being like, I should knock. And finally I did. I don't know what prompted it, but one day I knock on his door. He opens the door. He's in the middle of a lesson. And I tell him, I'm like, I was at your talk and I want to talk about race. And he was like, that's great. Let me take you out to lunch. And I didn't expect that. He's like, I'll take you out to lunch. We set a date like the next week. He took me out to lunch and just listened. And I listened to him. And at the end of it, I just still remember, I can picture like looking down at my salad with gorgonzola cheese on it. Like, this will never be erased from my memory. And he was like, what you are asking is important. Keep asking these questions. Keep learning about this. You're doing the right thing by asking. And that was so affirming to me. So I think we need these moments where people affirm like a learning process is going to take time and effort, but it's important. That right there, I think, is where so much of our energy goes in addressing racism. I think of racism as sort of a heart, soul, mind, body issue. Like, love the Lord your God with your heart and soul and mind and strength. And same thing for trying to mend social fabric with the neighbors we're trying to love, right? So the mind piece is like the asking why. The heart is often like the collision moment where you're like, ugh, like, there's this emotional response. But there's the soul piece. And that's where, like I said, people would tell a certain kind of story that would make them cry. And I was trying to piece together, like, what is the pattern here? What's going on here? Because it wasn't something I'd seen written about. And I realized what those stories had in common. They were often the emotional heart of people's story. Just to back up, one of the main questions I would ask when I was interviewing people is I would say, fill in the blank. I would not be committed to racial justice today if not for blank. And they would tell stories that often fit in that category of collision or learning and asking why, or this third kind. And that was what I call responding to grace. Grace was not something I wanted to write about because it's actually, I think, what often goes so poorly when white Christians are trying to deal with racism is I think often we want easy grace. Well, let me say some people want easy grace and some people want really hard grace. Easy grace is where you think, well, people of color can just forgive and get over it. Like, it's in the past. Why is this such a big deal? Our organization is spending way too much time on this. Let's get over it already, right? That's demanding grace. And if you think theologically about how grace is supposed to work, you don't get to demand it. If you demand it, it's not grace. It's a freely given gift. And so like there's this way in Christianity of dealing with guilt that is not like the rest of the world. And yet I've come to believe it is absolutely essential in dealing with racism. And that is realizing that you have been given more than you could ever receive, more than you can give back. And yet it anticipates a response. So the way grace often goes wrong too is people are like, okay, I'm forgiven, moving on with my life. But God is like the center of grace. He's the sort of the architect of it, right? And when God gives us grace, we're not supposed to just be like, thank you, peace out, right? Like, we're supposed to respond to it with our lifetime. And when you put that into the context of racism, what it means for people who've been through a history of harm that's been done by one group of people to another group is it's that you sort of come to this place of realizing, like, wow, the world is terribly messed up in a way that I can't fix. But what I can do is respond to what I have been given out of a sort of overflowing generosity that continues to kind of compel you throughout your lifetime. What I think is different there than how a lot of people approach racism is that a lot of people sort of approach it out of a like needs mindset of like, there's a need out there, it's terrible, things are bad, I probably should do something about it, which is like out of guilt, right? It's driven by white guilt. Whereas responding to grace is like, I have an overflow of too much. I've received too much already. And so what can I do to sort of live faithfully and joyfully and celebratorily out of what I've been given? It's to serve other people and to be a part of that mending process.
Yeah. I'm finding it difficult at points here to formulate questions because I'm just reliving moments of my life in my head as different things are
Are
coming
there
up.
ways you would answer that question of, if you would not be committed to racial justice if not for blank?
There are there are a couple of different um incidents, I think, that come to mind. The very first one was my freshman year of college. Again, I think this happens to people in college a fair amount. But we had what came to be known as the blackface incident,
Mm-hmm.
which was there was a like a male pageant for a fundraiser for a group on campus. For the like talent portion, someone was going to lip sync a song and decided that they wanted to look more like the artist than they actually did, and so went on and had painted their face. Uh, and for whatever reason, I ended up in a group of students who were trying to decide how to respond to the school's response to what had happened. Like my RA was part of a group that was probably I went to a very white Christian undergrad, and my RA was part of a group of BIPOC students who were like they found each other and united on campus sort of naturally. He invites me to go to this thing. I'm sitting in the corner seeing all these people react to what had happened. And I remember someone saying, I don't understand why the people who did this don't know why it was wrong. And I
Mm-hmm.
was sitting in the corner saying, I don't know why this was wrong to myself, which prompted, I think, a similar to you, like, I need to know more. Like, that's where the why questions start coming in. And so we had a reconciliation studies program, like an undergraduate degree at the school. And I was like, I've got space in my schedule. Let me take the intro class and see if I can figure out what this is all about. And that's where, like, that semester long class allowed me to start asking questions and start learning about things and reframing things to the point where I decided to add it fully as a major before the semester was done. And then
Mm-hmm.
that started to change the trajectory. So that's sophomore year. Spring break of sophomore year, I went on a missions trip to Chicago, and we were with an organization on the south side, and it was very much a you are doing the service during the day, but then also you are learning at night about what is happening in the neighborhood, what are the sort of broader systemic things that are happening, and uh, that solidified my need to move out of the I had been an engineering student and then I was a math student, and then I was like, I need to shift to focusing on the reconciliation.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Went to Guatemala junior year as part of the program, learned about the Justice and Mission program at Denver Seminary. So then graduated and went into that. So I'd spent this time learning about stuff, sort of book wise, some experiential stuff, and then ended up in a place where I couldn't find a job in that field. So I ended up at a camp in northern Minnesota, a Christian camp where there were not a lot of people asking the same questions I was.
Mm-hmm.
And it got to a point where I was like, what's the point of doing this if people around me don't care about what's happening? And so I still would have said I was committed to it, but the like active attempts at learning and engaging were going down. And there are a whole lot of different reasons for that. But then I moved back down to the cities in fall of 2019, and 6 months later, 8 months later, George Floyd was killed.
Mm-hmm.
And that was like that was the second, like, I can't not continue to focus on
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
Like it's like the like somewhat selfish voice inside me was like, this would have been a moment if I had been continuing to learn and
Mm,
study and create ways of helping other people learn about these things that I could have stepped into helping sort of answer some questions maybe.
yeah.
So some of the things that I'm doing now with the website of like helping people connect to resources and stuff like that.
Mhm.
But I just hadn't been working on it.
Yeah.
And that I think speaks to the ability to step away as a white person, like
Hmm.
to step out of the conversation, of literally geographically be able to
Yeah.
step out of the conversation too.
Hmm.
And so now it's at this point where like some of it is, I think, like I can't say that there's not lingering guilt, I think, in the background of
Mm,
like, don't ever let that happen again.
mm,
Like, which hopefully at some point is that like having been shaped into a being, a person who like that those things are embodied inside of the just the concern about racial justice and also the understanding of justice as an aspect of Christian discipleship. Like
yeah.
if this is true, which I believe it is, and this is the person that I want to be, these are the actions now that I need to take in order
Hmm.
to to actually live that way, to actually to actually like identify myself in that way, I guess, and
Hmm.
to accurately, effectively live out what I believe is a faithful
Yeah.
Christian life and witness.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a number of things I hear in that that really resonate with so much of what I heard in the book too. Like, a lot of people are drawn into it by having those kind of moments where it's like this is really wrong and I'm witnessing what's wrong. But you named also like traveling internationally, being an outsider in a culture often, and often it's like a really wonderful, joyful experience of that, of like being loved, being accepted as an outsider. Again, it fits into that idea of like responding to grace, of like people have loved me and therefore I want to give that to other people. It was a really common theme with a lot of people. And also, this pattern of like there's years that pass where people are like I don't know if I really even thought about racial justice for those years, because you can walk away from it. But the good side of that is you can step back into it. And sometimes we have this like bifurcated view of like, oh, there's all those like woke people who are the woke people, and then there's the non-woke people. And like it's not how we need to think of it, right? Like everybody is on a journey, and it's not a journey with like an endpoint where you arrive and you've like, figured it all out. And if anything, the more you sort of engage in it, especially at first, like, if you start thinking about how do I address racial injustice, it's going to involve putting yourself in a place where you might not be the minority, or you might not be the majority as a white person, and then you get there, and you are more likely to, make mistakes, and suddenly you realize, like, whoa, that was a microaggression. I shouldn't have done that, and so like it can feel harder when you get started. You can feel like you're doing a worse job of it than when you were doing nothing. And you need to just like kind of get over that, right? Just feel like that's normal, and keep going.
Yeah.
And the
I
other thing
want
I'll just say off of that
go
too is
ahead.
like, there wasn't like a cookie cutter what it looked like for these people to be doing racial justice.
That was
I
my next
intentionally,
question. Yeah.
oh yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, like I intentionally didn't give it my own definition of what is racial justice. I asked people that question. Everybody I interviewed, and then looked at how they answered that question. And there was quite a variety. I mean, for some people, it was like political activism has to be involved in it, or like addressing financial inequalities has to be a part of it. Some people had answers that were like very specific like that. But it definitely was not just one kind of a career. Like the people who were included in it included like, teachers, medical practitioners, people living in predominantly white spaces, people living in predominantly non-white spaces, like people going to multiracial churches, people going to predominantly white, predominantly black church. It wasn't like you have to like follow a certain prescription of where you live or who is your primary community. I found it really interesting that a lot of these people even were part of mostly white communities, like, the camp you were at. There's important work to be done. Staying where you're at in maybe like rural America where it's mostly white people, like that's a place for working for racial justice too. And sometimes we think it's like, oh, I have to go meet people who are people of color to like make a difference with them. But the work is with white people too. So it's really all over the place. Yeah. I don't know what was the question you actually wanted to ask?
It was the how do people who were involved in the study define working towards racial justice? Like, because that could be so broad.
Yeah.
I mean, you could think about different specific issues like housing, education,
Hmm.
go on down the line,
Yeah.
or so like one person probably is not working towards all of those things, even if some of us would like to be. So I would be curious to know how people
Yeah.
defined not just the white people who were respondents, but the people of color who said this is a person who's working towards racial
Mhm.
justice. Like,
Yeah.
what was it that people would identify as that is the defining characteristic?
Hmm. It was never one single thing. One phrase that I loved that I heard from someone who was talking about another woman that she'd recommended was she's like, it's just who she is. It's a phrase I heard from somebody was it's everyday love. It's not like, um, yeah, it's not necessarily a big dramatic thing that you tack on as like the extra part of your life. It just becomes woven into what you do. And I find the word vocation in Christian language to be really helpful in this too. I had a man who is a pastor in a multiracial church who was talking about how he counsels people of color in his congregation to engage with white people or people who are newer to the journey of racial justice. And he said, like, I have to counsel people, like, discern what you have. Like, this is people have different callings, different manifestations of our vocation. We're all following Christ, but the way we do that is different. For some person, it's housing. For somebody, it's education, right? But the way he put it too is like some people are called to really be gifted in being a bridge to white people who are maybe new to it, and like, taking the time to be that friend who's going to be like, yeah, please don't touch a black person's hair because that's really a microaggression, or like telling those beginning lessons. Some people like just don't have the energy for that. And like maybe we can all grow in patience, right? But like people have different callings. And I find that to be helpful too in thinking about how we live this out. That I think we too often put it in a box of like I'm either a racial justice called person or a not racial justice called person. And it's more like how does it relate to the callings that you have in your life?
Yeah. And some of that I think speaks into the conversation about grace,
Hmm.
having people who are willing to be the people either giving grace or like helping to explain. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
that helps a lot in terms of just learning in general. I mean, just thinking about learning styles even. Like
Yeah.
people will learn in different ways, but that I think is helpful to have someone who is willing to opt in to saying, "I will help you learn through this."
Hmm. Yeah.
I'm part of a intentionally multiracial church congregation. And
Hmm.
there's some of that, like, I don't know that it's ever explicitly been discussed, but you do have this understanding, like, there are people of color in that congregation who are there to kind of help be that bridge to helping to know. Like,
Hmm.
they don't need to be there. They could be
Hmm.
going to a different church and not trying to help white people who may or may not get it
Hmm.
kind of work their way through what's happening. And so
Yeah.
having those people actually around is really beneficial for people who are interested in learning.
Hmm.
That doesn't mean everyone has to be that person
Yeah.
for you.
Yeah. One of the stories that I heard that really helped me think about the idea of grace was from a white woman who she actually started her answer to my question about like I would not be committed to racial injustice if not for blank. And she started it and she was like, I don't think my journey is a lot like other people's. And what she said was she kind of assumed that most people start because they are really troubled by something terrible that happens. And she proceeded to tell a story about being in an international setting where people really cared for her in a way she didn't expect it to happen. And then she told this story about her grandmother, and her grandmother was in a retirement home as she was aging. And as often happens, as she was getting older and getting more dementia, she just was mean a lot of the time. And she was also just raised in an era and like had never really addressed her her racist tendencies. So she's this fairly racist woman who's working with these staff, and the staff included this black woman, and the woman I was interviewing said, she would watch her grandma like say things that were so mean and racist to this black staff woman. And she said it was amazing to watch the staff woman who didn't let it slide, like would tell her directly, like, that's not okay. And not put up with it, but then keep caring for her anyway. And so was not pretending it was okay, but was being blunt that it's not okay. And then when her grandmother passed away at the funeral, the one person who came from that facility to the funeral was this black woman who had put up with so much from this grandmother. And to me, that exemplifies a lot of aspects of grace. So one is that it's not denying that something's wrong, like it's not pretending it's okay, um, and it's anticipating that someone will respond, that this grandmother might change, but it's not demanding that. And it's also, in some cases, it's a forgiveness, and it's like, having the love to like come to this woman's funeral, but it doesn't get to demand a response. Like, the story did not end necessarily with this grandmother like being like, "Oh, I'm such a racist, I should change that." It doesn't necessarily. You don't get to demand that it changes anything, but it does have these knock-on effects often in ways we don't anticipate. And that's like in the life of this granddaughter who was like, I'll probably never see that woman again who came to this funeral. I can't repay that, but I can live differently because that story exists in the world. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's uh, a great thing to remember as well. That it can be like a pay it forward sort of
Yeah.
scenario as well.
Yeah. And like everybody I talked to was clear too. Like, it's not like white people need to stand around waiting until they get grace or forgiveness from
Yeah.
some individual black person who's going to be like, "I forgive you." Like, it's more so like respond to what's already been out there. Like, you already are living on land that was taken from Native American people. That's already a debt you owe to the world. So like, you've already been given more than you need, and start from that. And if you get more grace, awesome. But like, give more grace too.
Yeah. I'm curious. I feel like you do a really good job in the book of defining some of these, like grace, for example, where it's like, this is what grace isn't. This is
Mm.
what grace is. One of those other things I want to be sure we have time to talk about is hope.
Yeah.
Because really early in the book, you say, this is what, essentially, in my words, this is what a lot of people think hope is. It's not this. And
Yeah.
then it's not until the end of the book that we sort of go through defining what hope is. But you at least have that, like, this is not what hope is as I'm learning through what all these people are experiencing. Can you
Mhm.
talk a little bit about what hope is and is not, especially as relates to this conversation?
Yeah. I'll tell a story here too from my own life. So, when I was living in South Africa, the seminary that I was working with hit a point where they were running out of money. And we called this prayer meeting. The students actually organized it. And the students were from all over the African continent. And most of them had saved for years to be able to get a seminary degree. This was an expensive and very unique opportunity for them. And we found out that our seminary was running out of money and probably going to close. So we're at this prayer meeting. I'm standing in this room that's just packed with people, and everyone is shouting because that's how you pray in South Africa, is like stand up, shout. And we're praying in desperation, really, because like we had done pretty much everything we could think of to do to raise more money for this seminary, and it wasn't looking good. And I'm doing what I'm supposed to do, right? Like, I've been in South Africa for 4 years at this point. I know, like, you say, like, God, you are magnificent, you are good, powerful. You like, I'm praying in the way I feel like I'm supposed to. And I hit this point where I just was like, I've run out of words. Like, I just went silent and just sat there and started listening to the people around me. And there's this woman on my left who's Rwandan and has lived through the genocide, and she's still praying. And there's a man on my right who's Zambian, and he's lived through a heart attack, and he's still praying. And there's a woman in front of me who's Congolese. She's come out of a war. She's still praying. And I just hit this point where I realized my hope is not resilient enough. And I have been taught a way of hope that is not enough. And when I started doing interviews for this book, that came back to me because so many white people I would talk to, I'd say, like, what's changed in the years that you've been doing this? And they'd say, I don't hope like I used to. And I'd be like, how do you hope differently? And then people would pause and they'd be like, I don't know. And so one thing I realized was they knew they hope differently, but we often don't have words to describe different kinds of hope. We often talk about hope as just like, you should just get more of it. Like, hope, find it, right? And I don't think it's just a scale of like less to more. It's not just a unilinear thing. It's actually multidimensional, and it matters what kind of hope you have. Kind of like, it's not just more or less trees. There's all different kinds of trees. There's all different kinds of hope. And so two of the things that I recognize in that sort of unstable, flabby hope is it's optimistic. And by optimistic, I mean it psychologically distances oneself from the bad. So it's ignoring that there is a reality that is bad out there and saying like, oh, let's just look on the bright side. Surely it's going to be fine. Another word I use for it is it's conventional hope, meaning we just want more of the same. Like just hold on a little bit longer. And you can imagine how those two characteristics of hope can really hold white supremacy. And by that, I mean just like holding white people in a place of power in society, because it's saying, well, don't change too much and don't really complain about what's wrong. Let's just keep things the same and hopefully it'll all work itself out. But that doesn't work when you really encounter injustice. And so a lot of people who start working toward justice hit a point where they're like, what do I do when things are not going well? And maybe they have never gone well for this population of people. Then what? So then what's hope? And that's where I got through listening to people. And I asked the questions of like, why do they hope? What do they hope for? And how do they live in that hope? One of the basic keys to that is it's a hope that struggles. It's a hope that knows it's not going to come easy. There was a woman I talked to who used the analogy of Sisyphus pushing a boulder up a hill over and over again. And she said, white people focus on getting the boulder to the top. And black people, she's a black woman in her 80s, she's like, we focus on what is Sisyphus's body like now? Like, look at the muscles in his body. Look at who he's become through that struggle. And I think that ties back to this idea of like what you're doing is important, right? Like push the boulder in the right direction. But it's also who are you becoming in that? And how is Christ glorified through the very becoming? If we don't solve racism in our lifetime, it will not surprise me. It will not surprise anybody in this book. But we are still pushing in a direction, and it's changing who we are. And it's how we exemplify the body of Christ is through that struggle. And knowing that God does that too, right? Like God struggles, God brings the good into the middle of the bad.
Yeah. We've had a lot of conversations recently on the podcast about what change looks like, sort of who is responsible for what sort of change, and that we are not capable of making other people change. And so that's like, that I think to me speaks into this, like, it's not my responsibility to make other people change.
Yeah.
Like, which an example that comes to mind as we're here coming to a close is my wife and I, before we were engaged, were part of a relationship retreat that was talking about conflict. And one of the statistics that came up was 70% of conflict in a marriage will not be resolved. It's just sort of an ongoing thing, which to me in the moment was like actually super hopeful for me, where I was like, oh, I don't have to solve everything. And as people who are married know, that doesn't mean you don't work at addressing conflict. Like if you
Yeah.
want your marriage to continue, you need to continue to address conflict, even if it's not going to be resolved. But it
Yeah.
is in that like the continuation, the like there are people who have been doing this for longer than me and who will continue to do it once I'm gone. Like that's I think where I'm the hope that I'm seeing right now, especially in the midst of the political everything that is happening in the United States and places where a lot of us probably who are listening have disagreements with what's happening is the like a word I've had coming to mind is remnant,
Mm,
like with Elijah being told by God, you're not the only one. There's this remnant of people who are still faithful. Like
yeah.
it is in this like coming together and in this long form of work. And that's where I think also we need to be focused on the being and not as much on not be focused on doing, but a previous podcast guest talked about how, in a separate conversation I had with them, talked about how when we only focus on the work, it is much easier to fall away, because once the work doesn't work, like what do we have left to fall back on? Whereas if
Mhm.
we're focused on the being, then that's where, once we have embodied it, once it is a part of us, it is much more difficult for that to go away.
Yeah. Yeah. Can I read just a couple of quotes from the book that maybe will be a place to wrap up some of the things that you were just saying?
Go for it.
Um, I really liked what you said about remembering that maybe we're a remnant sometimes, that there's power in sometimes being a part of the minority. Like the church didn't start out as feeling like they were the majority in their culture. And I think remembering that being small doesn't mean that God isn't with us. This is a paragraph in the first chapter of the book that's kind of writing to my audience, saying what I hope for you as a reader. It says, if you're anything like me, this journey comes with a lot of tears, some cursing, and throwing a book or two across the room. It can be lonely and tedious. It very well may break your heart. But let me say again what I want you to know. You are not alone. You're going to meet a certain kind of unusual people in this book. Together, we're going to scoop out the litter that has clogged up our wellspring of hope, scrub it out, and see whether we find something shimmering. And if I can, I'd love to close with a quote from an Asian American woman that I interviewed in this research too. And she's describing what it looks like to have that kind of hope that doesn't necessarily expect it to get better in our lifetime, but struggles along anyway. She said, I think my hope is the spirit intercedes. So I don't need to be the only one who watches what's going wrong. The truth may be that I witnessed a lot of destruction in my lifetime, but ultimately, if nothing can separate us from the love of God, then I will hold on to that. I can sit in a mystery of holding on to hope. I can say, even that, everything I see going wrong, will not be so powerful to separate us from the love of God. I am fundamentally a person of hope, not because of me personally, but because I live in these faith traditions. My hope is not shiny or happy at all. It's totally bruised and bloodied, and it's scraping by my fingernails. On days you may not be able to see it, but there's maybe a scrap of it hanging on and pressing on. Another thing I love that somebody said is, if we had to bet on humanity, we shouldn't. I'm not betting on humanity. And she said, we're part of the bucket brigade. Just get in the bucket brigade and do what you can. But it's not our job, it's God's job, and we're a part of that.
Yeah. Well, like I said at the start, I was really excited to come into this conversation, and now at the end of it, I'm really glad that we had it. So, thank you so much for joining me, Dr. Jeske.
A joy to get to talk with you. Thanks so much for the invitation.
Thank you for listening to the Biblical Justice Resources Podcast. This podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Eric Beck. To learn more about how you can be resourced for the pursuit of biblical justice, visit our website at biblicaljusticeresources.com.